I'm a retired Jungian
Okay.
therapist, sandplay therapist. And, in that system, you meditate on images,
Hmm.
dream images and so on and so forth. And I find still that dreams and active imagination is a resource. It's an internal resource
Yeah.
that brings me or provides joy and insight and so on. But I've never heard any mindfulness teacher discuss, images. It's always the cognitive stuff and trauma and so on. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, about this, the imagistic level as a resource, inner resource. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Well, if I think I might know what you mean, and correct me if I wander off. First, let me just say, for the record, and it is being recorded, that I think that Jung was the greatest psychologist of all time. Technically, he was right. I think he was trained as a physician. I believe as a psychiatrist, but broadly, no, Jung. And maybe this has to do with mindfulness teachers as well. I'll give you a little story. You may know it already. I saw a black and white movie of Jung in England in the 1950s talking with a bunch of psychiatrists there. And someone asked him in that polite but very provocative British way, where's Liliana? But you know what I'm talking about. Uh, so who do you think's right, you or Freud? And Jung smiled, that kind of Swiss smile of his, and he said, well, I think some people have a Freudian psychology, and some people have a Jungian psychology. And if you have a Freudian psychology, Freud is good for you. And maybe a few people have a Jungian psychology, and I might have something to offer them. It was a very interesting way to put it, right? A kind of acceptance of diversity of teachings and teachers and an openness, and it's really sweet. So, if I follow you, we can be mindful of whatever is streaming through consciousness, whatever is appearing, passing away. We can be mindful of being mindful. We could be aware of awareness. We can go to these, metacognitive levels, if you will, cognitive broadly stated. So we can certainly be aware of thoughts. We can be aware of images. Now, it may well be true that a lot of mindfulness teachers don't really talk about being aware of imagery. And and I think that's a very important thing to talk about. There's a Zen saying, "Nothing left out," and yet we're tending to always leave things out, including through privileging. We kind of privilege our way of being, and we leave out other ways of knowing, other ways of feeling. I'm doing it here. I'm speaking from my background, my style. White male, cisgender, hetero guy, and professional, academically trained. There are other ways to teach this wonderful material and talk about it, and it's really important to include them. So flagging, like you are, what routinely is left out is so helpful. And so I think bringing mindful awareness to imagery and to even, as you well know, more archetypal imagery or the deeper layers. Or, there you are. I kind of think of it like you're sitting on the edge of the stream of consciousness, witnessing it, as it were. And all this flotsam and jetsam is going by, right? I think about this, I'm planning that, I'm hopping on board some train of thought, whoops, recognize it, come back to the banks, observing it rather than being carried away, fine. And then along comes this little sailboat. Like, what? This sort of shadowy thing, this kind of nasty, warded off part of yourself. Ooh, what's that about? Or, um, animus parts, archetypal parts, disowned parts, gods and goddesses within us, James Hillman kind of stuff. Really interesting stuff. And I'll go out on a limb here and say, as a teacher of meditation, I think there are times where we drop into deliberately choiceless awareness and we don't privilege any mental contents. We just rest in not doing as deeply and pervasively and continuously as we possibly can. Super. And I think there can be a lot of value if a person can do this skillfully, whether it's on retreat, frankly, or in their living room when they're just, meditating in whatever way they meditate, or elsewhere. That they notice something coming along in the flotsam and jetsam, and they go, "Whoop! I'm going to spend a few minutes focusing on that. I'm going to shift out of mindful witnessing and do a little therapy on myself or
Mhm.
do a little exploration, a little inquiry. Maybe I'm go, what is that about? Like I've gotten a lot of value from while meditating, being aware of various neurotic reactions. Like I'm so mad about that, or I'm just watching myself build up this case about this person. Wait a minute, Rick, what's that about? Is that really true? What's underneath it? What's softer, more vulnerable under that anger? Let's explore this a little bit. So I'm stepping out of, mindfulness of breathing into actively engaging the content, but doing so on the basis of some stability of present moment awareness and kind of a calm, a centeredness, other good factors, warming the heart that come into meditation. So it's productive to actually do that. And then after a few minutes, 10 at the most, really, you come back to meditating and in a freer, looser way. And that's a very good way to go back to what we talked about with Diane to help whatever the insight was to establish itself. Because you can really help good psychological growth and healing land in a meditative framework because you're not being distracted. You can stay with it. You don't have to rush on to make a meal or take someone to school or deal with an email. So I'm all for that. I
Yeah.
think that, yeah, I'll just say last in my own background in Western meditative circles, primarily in the kind of Theravadan Vipassana world or secular mindfulness, I'll I'll say something maybe controversial, but I've just often had the sense that, with some significant exceptions, that there was a kind of discomfort from our murkier, more primal, more savage, more id saturated in Freud's languaging interior, and that in other people, and a kind of swerving away from it, like, oh, that's going to drive craving. Oh, those are the defilements. Moralistic language right there. Those are
Mhm.
the, like the afflictions. And what are we leaving out? What are we warding off? If the return of the repressed, if we push it away, language from Freud, right?
Mhm.
It tends to come back. I laugh. The mind is not a flush toilet. It's more like a septic tank. That stuff sticks around.
Mhm.
And, you know, uh, so I think it's really important. There's been a movement, which is wonderful. Somatically inclined people, the movement of women and people of color and marginalized people and indigenous first people into the more secular mindfulness or Western mindfulness world has brought with them some of this inclusion of these elements that I think is really important. And I've known, frankly, various teachers, various in high levels who are really good at what they do still. They would be served by paying more attention to their own murky, nonverbal, imagistic, wild interior. It would serve them a lot.